So let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something super important if you're involved in building anything, really. We're talking contract management.
Right, yeah.
And for this, we're going to be checking out a transcript, actually, from a YouTube channel.
Oh, cool.
It's called Thul Oche. And the speaker is Dr. Mohammed Wagdi Shaheen.
Okay.
Now, the main thing we're trying to really get clear on here is the difference between what's called contract administration and what's called contract management.
Ah, I see.
In Arabic, those are couche and aku ekshne, and it's not just like, oh, words are different.
Right.
This actually changes how you approach a whole project. It can, like, make or break the success of the thing you're trying to build.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are we kind of looking at like, is there really a difference or is it just people using different words for the same thing?
Right, exactly. That's one of the big questions from this presentation we're looking at. And then also, do these roles like actually do different things during the whole process?
During the different phases, you mean?
Yeah. So we're talking design phase, procurement, like getting all the stuff you need, then the tendering, the actual building execution, closing it all out at the end.
And then even afterwards, right?
Yeah, like if there are claims, people saying, hey, you didn't do this right, or if it goes to like arbitration, that kind of stuff.
Which, let's be honest, happens on like almost every project.
Yeah, and that's what makes this so important to understand from the beginning.
Absolutely.
But it's not just for the contract people, right?
All right, good point.
It's for anyone involved. So whether you're planning the project, controlling the costs, everyone needs to be on the same page about this.
Yeah, I mean, if those early stages, especially design, get rushed
Yeah.
and you're making bad choices, maybe because you got to get the cheapest consultant or you rush picking the documents, you're just asking for trouble.
Right, and then you get delays.
Oh, for sure.
Costs go through the roof, and the quality of what you're building can just tank.
Makes you wonder why anyone rushes it.
Right. But that's where knowing the difference between contract administration and this management part, that's like your foundation from day one.
Makes sense. So tell me about this Dr. Shaheen. Who is this guy?
Oh, he's got a ton of experience, which is what makes his perspective so valuable.
Okay.
So he's worked in Egypt, the Gulf, the U.S., and Europe, like all over.
Wow. So he's seen how different regions handle this stuff.
Exactly. And one thing he points out, especially about, I guess you could say like the Arab world, is what he calls this definition fixation.
Definition fixation. What's that?
It's like they're stuck on these old school definitions of what contract administration is, and it's not keeping up with how things actually work.
Got it. Kind of like trying to use a map from the 50s to drive around today.
Yeah, exactly. And he makes a big point that this field, just like, technology or just how we understand things, it's constantly changing.
So what's the difference then, according to him? Like, what's the big aha moment?
So he says the traditional way, contract administration, it's all about what happens before you sign the contract.
Before, okay.
But contract management is about after it's signed, and then it sticks with you for the entire life of that project.
So it's like one's short term, the other's long haul.
And their scope's different. That's what we got to understand.
All right, let's start with the traditional one then. Like, what actually happens in contract administration?
Okay, so Dr. Shaheen lays out some steps, right? It starts with figuring out, okay, what does the company need from outside?
Like people to actually do the work.
Yeah, so suppliers, contractors, any kind of service providers.
Right. Got to find the right people.
And then you got to make a list, a database of all these potential partners and keep it up to date.
Okay, keep it fresh.
Then you got to talk to them, understand what they can offer.
Make sure they're a good fit for the project.
And then comes the RFP.
RFP, right? Request for proposal. That's where the bidding starts.
Exactly. You send that out, get the bids back, got to evaluate all those, pick the best one.
Lots of paperwork, I bet.
Oh, tons. Then you write up the actual contracts, get everyone to sign.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Oh, it is. And here's the thing he points out.
Yeah.
Once the contract's signed, in that traditional way, it's like they file it away and only pull it out if there's a fight.
Huh.
Yeah.
Almost like it's just a historical document.
Right. They miss this huge chance to be proactive, to prevent problems before they even start.
So contract management, that's where things get different.
Huge difference.
Okay, but does it include all that stuff we just talked about?
Oh, yeah. It builds on all that.
Okay, so what's the big difference then? What's the light bulb moment?
It's all about what you do after the contract's signed. That's where the real work starts.
Okay, so walk me through it. What's the first thing?
You really got to dissect that contract, like take it apart piece by piece.
Why? What are you looking for?
You're figuring out exactly who's responsible for what.
And we're talking about within the company, right? Not just the contractors.
Yeah, every single department that has a hand in making this project happen.
I see. So it's not just the construction team or the project manager.
Nope, you've got finance, administration, legal, even operations. Everyone's got a part to play in fulfilling that contract.
Which makes sense, right? If everyone's working from the same playbook, you're much more likely to succeed.
Exactly. It's about connecting everyone to the bigger picture.
Okay, so once you know who's supposed to be doing what, then what?
Think of the contract manager, like the conductor of an orchestra.
Okay, I like that analogy.
They're the ones who take that big, complex contract and break it down into smaller, manageable parts.
So they're simplifying it, making it easier to understand for everyone.
Exactly. And then they assign those parts, like specific responsibilities, to the right departments.
Makes sense. So it's not just handing them the whole contract and saying good luck.
Right. And then the most important part, they got to keep an eye on everyone, make sure they're actually doing what they signed up for.
Making sure everyone's following the music.
And that's where you see those interconnections between departments.
Oh, yeah. Can you give an example of that?
Dr. Shaheen talks about, like, imagine if the finance department is late with payments.
Right.
Even if the construction team is on schedule, that can throw everything off.
Yeah, the contractor can't pay their people, get materials.
And then they have a legitimate claim against you.
Totally.
Or, like, what if the admin people, they're slow getting permits?
Right. They can hold things up too.
That has contractual consequences as well. So even departments that seem far removed from the actual building, they can really make or break it.
Yeah, it really emphasizes how important communication is between everyone.
Absolutely. And the contract manager, they can't just hand over the contract and be done.
Right. They got to keep everyone informed.
Exactly. They got to break down those clauses, explain them in plain English, and tell each department what they need to do and when.
So, like, specifically telling the finance department, payment needs to be processed by this date, no exceptions.
Exactly. It turns that static document into a tool that keeps everyone on track and prevents problems.
And if you're on top of things like that, you can catch issues before they become disasters.
That's the whole point, that early warning system. So you spot things like delays or if someone's not going to meet their obligations.
And then you can actually do something about it.
Right. Exactly. Maybe you amend the contract. Maybe there's some other agreement you can work out. But the point is you're protecting the company by being proactive.
It's like instead of waiting for the house to catch fire, you're making sure all the smoke detectors are working.
Perfect analogy. It's a whole different mindset than just waiting for problems to explode.
Totally.
Yeah.
So what about those claims we talked about before? Like, how does contract management help with that?
Well, Dr. Shaheen, he's pretty blunt. He says claims are basically unavoidable in construction.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the reality, right?
It's not about if they'll happen, it's about when.
So you got to be ready for them.
And that's where good contract management comes in. Because if you've been on top of things all along, you've built a strong case.
Right. Either to support your own claims or to defend against someone else's.
Exactly. And speaking of which, you got to know the timelines.
Timelines for what?
Like in those FIDI contracts, there are deadlines for when you can submit a claim and when you have to respond.
Ah, right. FIDA, yeah. Fédération Internationale des Ingénieurs Conseils, for those who haven't heard of it.
It's like the contract manager's got to be a clock watcher.
Otherwise, you miss your chance.
Exactly. And all of this helps the project manager, too.
Also.
Well, think about it. The contract manager is feeding them all this info, making sure they know what's up contractually.
So they can talk to everyone else on the project with confidence.
Right. And if something comes up, they're not blindsided, they're ready.
That's huge, especially when things get heated.
But this is where you see the difference in those roles, administration versus management.
Okay, break it down for me.
Those traditional contract admins, often they don't really have the power to make other departments do what the contract says.
They can't, like, force them to follow through.
Right. They're mostly focused on the writing and the filing of the contract.
Okay, but contract managers, they have more teeth.
Way more. They have to be able to engage with other departments, even tell them what to do to make sure everyone's following the contract.
That's a huge difference. So they have the authority to make sure things actually happen.
Right. It's not just about hoping everyone plays nice. And they can't fall into the blame game.
What do you mean?
Dr. Shane says on big projects, problems rarely have just one cause.
Right. It's usually a bunch of things going wrong.
So the contract manager's got to figure out what all those causes are, not just point fingers.
Be a problem solver, not a problem pointer outer.
Exactly. So he gets into the specifics like, what do you do as a contract manager?
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the first thing?
Right from the start, once the contract's signed, You're building this thing called a responsibility assignment matrix.
Oh, what now?
It's often called a RACI
As
matrix.
I,
It's basically a chart, and you go through the contract clause by clause.
I'm assuming RICI stands for something.
Oh, yeah, it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed.
So you're figuring out who's doing what for each part of the contract.
Right, and you're assigning those roles to the right people in the company.
So someone's responsible for making sure it happens, someone's accountable if it doesn't, someone needs to be consulted, and someone just needs to be kept in the loop.
You got it. And it's not just the obvious departments either.
Okay, so who are we talking about?
You got to have finance in there for payments, administration for permits, legal for all the legalities, the people actually executing the work.
Engineering, I'm guessing, for the technical stuff?
Oh, yeah, and even top management, because they might need to approve things.
So it's pretty comprehensive.
And Dr. Shaheen says, if you're doing this right, every key department should be on that chart.
Because if they're not, it means something's probably falling through the cracks.
Exactly. It ensures that someone's owning every part of the contract.
Okay, so what comes next?
And you got to really dig into the terms and conditions.
Oh, the actual contract. Right?
Yes. Don't just rely on those standard templates like FIDIC.
Right, because those are just a starting point.
Exactly. There can be special conditions, amendments, all kinds of stuff that changes those standard clauses.
So you got to know how it all fits together in this specific contract.
Exactly. And then, this is where it gets kind of cool, actually.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
You make a digital matrix of the contract.
A digital what now?
So you take that written contract and put it into a computer, like an Excel or a special contract management system, and then you can track all the important dates, like deadlines, when payments are due, milestones, all that.
And I bet you can set reminders, right?
Exactly. You get alerts for upcoming deadlines so nothing slips through the cracks.
That's amazing. Like giving the contract a brain.
Right. And Dr. Shaheen talks about having a payment master sheet, for example.
So you can see at a glance when everything needs to be paid.
And it keeps everyone on track, financially speaking.
Okay, so what's next after you've got your digital brain working for you?
Then you got to look at the project milestones.
But isn't that already in the project schedule?
It is, but this is about looking at it from a different angle.
What do you mean?
It's about seeing how those milestones affect the departments that aren't directly involved in construction.
So, like, if a certain milestone requires a permit, you make sure the administration team is on top of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You set alerts for those departments to make sure their actions support the overall project timeline.
So you're preventing delays before they even happen.
Exactly. It's about seeing the whole web of connections between different parts of the company.
And how they all contribute to hitting those milestones.
Right. Then comes something called variation analysis.
Which sounds a little scary.
It's not too bad. It's basically about keeping track of any changes that happen during the project.
Any changes, even small ones.
Everything, whether it's a formal change order or just something that comes up in a meeting.
Okay, so why do you need to track every little thing?
Because you got to understand how those changes affect everything else.
Like the schedule, the budget.
Exactly, and other parts of the work. Even small tweaks can have ripple effects.
So it's about seeing the big picture impact of any changes.
Right, and that leads to the next step, which is contingency planning.
So like having a backup plan.
Exactly. You figure out, okay, if this change happens, what are our options?
Like a plan B, plan C, just in case.
And this is where input from the site team is crucial.
Because they're the ones who really know what's going on.
Exactly. They can tell you what's realistic, what might actually work.
So you're not just making plans in a vacuum.
And it gives you leverage when you're negotiating those changes.
Because you've thought it through, you know what your alternatives are.
Exactly. And then there's the schedule.
We already talked about that with the milestones.
We did, but there's a subtle difference here.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's about understanding the difference between updating the schedule and revising it.
So an update just reflects progress, right?
Right, it's saying where you are compared to the original plan.
But a revision is actually changing the plan itself.
Exactly. And that usually happens because of those changes we talked about, variations that get approved.
And the contract manager is involved in that.
Big time. They got to figure out if a revision is really needed and then work with the planners to make it happen.
So they're making sure the schedule stays aligned with the contract.
Exactly. Then comes the unglamorous part, documentation.
The paperwork never ends, does it?
Nope, but this is crucial. You got to keep records of everything.
Everything. What do you mean by that?
Every communication, every